And I want to say welcome everyone to our design school update for today, where yet again, we have a lot that's happened in the last 2 weeks, a lot that's emerging into the emerging horizon of the future. And I have been incredibly busy, so it was actually difficult to make time to put together a slide deck for today. So I got up bright and early and did that. And it's because Penny and I are on our last day in the greater Takaranto bioregion. We're going to be jumping on an airplane at about midnight tonight and doing a red eye to Bogota. And so my day started at 3 a.m. and ends at like 3 p.m. tomorrow. But what's been really, really incredible for us in this last week and a half is really deeply immersing ourselves into a patterning of how different institutions and relationships are just becoming more coherent, which is a process that will probably last for years because this landscape is so complex. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the Toronto area, we're on the north shores of Lake Ontario. We're in a very unique geologic context with the Oak Ridges moraine formed by ice sheets grinding up the landscape for a couple of million years to produce the birthplace of about 60 rivers, all of which flow north, south, east, and west out of this giant gravel and sand pit made by the glaciers, and in one of the most water abundant places on Earth, but also with a human population of about 8 million and ridiculous complexity in terms of human institutions and relationships. And this morning, Brian and I were on a call with someone who was doing circular economy design with farmers to transition to regenerative agriculture. And they had helped incubate 300 businesses in the last 5 years, closing loops of waste in the food system. And just to have a sense of the scale of complexity of things that happen here, because they probably don't even make a dent in the food system with that. And then I was just on a call with these amazing conservation authorities that Ontario has that were organized around, if I remember correctly, it was a big flooding event back in the 50s, maybe in the 60s. But anyway, there was a big flooding event and they created conservation authorities organized around watersheds. So they actually have like pretty impressive infrastructure in terms of institutions already mapped to major landscape features. Unfortunately, recent political winds have gone in the direction of trying to weaken the conservation authorities because they're so effective at actually healing landscapes. So anyway, little hints and flavors of the complexity of this landscape. But what I want to do today is give you all another one of those momentary snapshots of what is happening in the design school and what kind of coherence is emerging and where we see ourselves going. And I think the most flagrant omission in the focus of what I'll talk about today is where things are going into the Cascadia tour, which I know Brandon is very intimately connected with, and Claire is very intimately connected with. But that basically there's a process that's been unfolding for several months now that is moving toward a really big pulse of activation and energy about 6 or 7 weeks from now. And I will not speak very much to that today because there's so much else going on. And I want to just paint the picture of coherence, the picture of what is becoming coherent. And so with that in mind, I think it'd be good to jump right into the presentation so we have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. And welcome, Brian. Long time since I've seen you. Brian and I were just on another call like 5 minutes ago. And so part of what I'm going to do today is a bit of show and tell about our travels. So I'll be showing you some of our travel pics and giving a bit more context about what has been happening here in the last week and a half than the little teaser versions we've been able to share. But I think the most important thing that I'll say before starting the slideshow is that, or the presentation, is that one of the things we've made really clear from the beginning of the design school back in March can you believe it's only been since March 1st, is that there is a way in which we are aggregating and deepening our capacities in really specific directions. And some of them are surprises, and some of them we've talked about all along. So one of the surprises that I'll be sharing with you today is how powerfully we think we're about to move into organizing young people around the world, which was not exactly on our agenda before about 5 days ago. Not to say we didn't think about young people, we did, but we didn't think of them as a major action space and priority space for, say, the next 2 months. But that will become clear as I share today. So with that in mind, I'll stop tantalizing and jump into the presentation. And there will be plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So here we are. Let me move this guy out of my way so I can see you all. And let's get started. So this is our design school update for August 8th. And thing I want to really stress today is that we made a really strategic decision about 2.5 months ago, which is that when the design school started, we had a learning journey for 8 weeks where we had a weekly webinar and we talked about what is the design school. And we could already feel the tendency of the design school to start to feel like any other online course or virtual learning environment, which is the main purpose of an online learning environment, is to learn online. And we were deeply disturbed by that. What I mean is we were already aware that's not what we wanted to become. So we made a very clear and very strong, sharp turn to the left and focused on landscapes. And so between about 2.5 months ago and now, what the design school has been doing is accumulating in the direction of coherence around what's happening within bioregions. And what that means is we are honing in our focus on what we consider to be the most powerful part of the design school, which is the landscape leaders in the different landscapes. I think many of you on this call, like Brian, who's working with Susan and with our third silent partner, Douglas, at the Legacy Project here in Ontario, are a leadership team. Roberta is part of a leadership team in Maine. Claire and Brandon are part of a leadership team in Cascadia. And then we just go on and on down the line. There are all these different landscapes where there are people organizing within them. And what we are doing is focusing on how to work with landscape leaders to build coherence within and between landscapes. And that this is the direction that the design school has gone for half of its life, and that we're fully going in that direction now. And I think that'll become clear with where this presentation goes today. And so as I briefly tantalized with this idea 2 weeks ago in the last design school update, one thing that's really becoming clear for us is we're not just talking about creating a planetary network of bioregions. We're creating a planetary network of bioregions. And so one of the things that we can already sense as a future direction for ourselves is that the design school for regenerating Earth is actually part of something bigger. The something bigger needs to be created. Some of its parts already exist, but as a coherent platform, it doesn't yet exist. And so part of the backdrop of the conversations that we'll be having throughout the design school in general and in these design school updates is how can we actually move toward creating tapestries of landscapes on continents, multiple continents, and to create a capacity to organize around the entire planet reorganizing itself as a network of bioregions. So that as nation states go away, as the globalized economy eats itself to death, as the biosphere continues collapsing, as abrupt climate change keeps occurring, all of these things are happening, that we are able to build a parallel process that lives through these collapses throughout the next few decades and maybe the next 200 to 300 years, and that we arrive at humans having not gone extinct and have actually reorganized themselves into their landscapes and tapestries of landscapes up to continental scales, so that the human presence on Earth is fully embodied as bioregional. And we see that larger multi-100-year vision as being what the design school is really about. And that's why it's so important for us to create coherence around leadership teams, around landscapes, and around the nested scales of how landscapes relate to each other, into larger patterns like the greater Takaranto area being part of the Great Lakes, or the Roaring Fork Valley and the western slopes of Colorado being part of the Colorado Basin, or the Salish Sea connecting to the Fraser River, and then the 100 or more river systems that are part of the Fraser River, that is distinct from the Columbia River, which is distinct from the Willamette River, even though the Willamette River drains into the Columbia River, and all those are part of Cascadia, and so on and so forth, which is that in different parts of the world, we have to hold these nested levels and all of their complexity, and that this is the direction of regenerative work worldwide. And so in the last 2 weeks, which is, a little tiny dip into this much larger process, we've already been making progress in multiple areas, colored in green, and we'll go through them in subsequent slides. But the important thing is that in the last 2 weeks, as the leadership of the design school, which you could say is, you could have said was Benji, Penny, and myself, but now we've actually built more leadership structures and have more decentralized leadership starting to emerge. And so most of the focus of this culture of leadership in the design school, most of our focus has been on immersive work within landscapes. And so that means that there has been less going on online, and there's a lot more happening in the flesh, and that there's a real need for the coherence of what's happening on the ground to come back into the stories of what we can see together online. And so we need to start seeking more harmony across the school as a whole that can keep up with and hold the energy that's being unleashed in the landscapes. So as you're going to see in a moment, when I give a teaser version of what's happened here, whereas Penny and I are hanging out with Brian and Susan and a bunch of other people. Yes, we got to hang out with Preston briefly on Thursday night, and a lot of other design school members throughout the last week, that we're trying to build back toward harmony. And at the same time, Benji and a bunch of other people are super active in their landscapes in the Colorado Basin. And we need to create more coherence for bringing that back at the pattern level to what's happening online across the school as a whole. And so one of the areas that we've had a lot of progress in the last 2 weeks is with new community members. We created the community level membership in June. Here we are in August. It's less than 2 months since we opened up this possibility of inviting people in at the community level. And 2 weeks ago, it was something like this. There were more design level members, colored blue, and less community level members, colored green. But as of right now, they're about equal. That basically the design level members more or less stayed the same. We've had a couple of design level members either end their subscriptions and leave the school or move to the community level, but it's approximately the same number, whereas the community level members have grown substantially. I think in the last 2 weeks, we've had about 25 or 30 new community level members, which means in the future, which is what we would expect, is that very soon there will be a lot more community level members relative to the number of design level members. Now, the design level members are the ones who are actively engaging in collaboration and governance and decision-making and allocation of resources from the design school fund, leading and participating in design labs, working in their landscapes and leadership ways, which is really not what the community level members want. Meaning the community level members mostly are coming here to figure out what this place is. They're attending our online webinars and our social spaces like campfires. They're attending the bioregional updates to learn what's going on. They're dipping toes into the stream. Or they're people who are interested in becoming financial supporters and giving $5 a month or $50 a year to the school, but they're just lurking and not very active. And so we expect the number of community members to grow dramatically. And this opens a really interesting question that our community leaders and our landscape leaders have been asking. They've been asking, why should I invite members of my own community into the school? And it turns out that question is much more interesting than it sounds, because it's not that they doubt the value of the school. It's not like they're saying $5 is too much. Why should people be here? Turns out that this has been a ridiculously generative question, because as we explore it in different contexts, like when Claire is asking, how would members of my community that are leading activities in Victoria or in the Cowichan Valley, how would I invite them into the design school? What would we do together? Or maybe Brian and Susan, who are doing so much organizing on the ground, they may be a little freaked out by the question, how would I host and support community members online? I'm already too busy. And so this question of why should I invite community members into the school is beautifully nuanced, and it's led to some really interesting answers. For example, in the delta of the Colorado River, in the Mexicali area of Baja California, which is part of the Colorado River Basin, an idea emerged from the leadership team. Mainly it was from the amazing entrepreneur and business designer, Benedo, who's part of that team. He said, what if we organized the youth of Mexicali and we went and found local businesses in Mexicali who would give money to provide scholarships to high schoolers. And then we would give high schoolers a 1-year program in the design school. And because there's already a lot happening in Mexicali, where the leadership team is bringing together local projects and local leadership and a network of nonprofits, a network of regenerative farms, a network of landscape restoration, a network of community engagement, would it make sense to find a local business that gives $1,000? And with that $1,000, they're able to provide 20 scholarships, and then 20 high schoolers get 1 year of the design school. And the local leadership team is already organizing these volunteer and community engagement opportunities. And now the high schoolers can meet each other across the territory, learn about regeneration, regenerative economics, planetary collapse, Earth systems, other things they're not going to learn in high school, and be chaperoned over to existing and curated lists of volunteer and community engagement opportunities for $50 a year, paid for by a local business. Cha-ching! Benedo has a beautiful idea. So we tell that idea to Brian and Susan here in the greater Takaranto bioregion, and they adapted the idea. And they said, what if we organized our youth program? Because Brian and Susan have a grant that's funding them to do a lot of this work right now. And in that grant, they have part of the funding going to an Eco Leaders program where they're working with children between the ages of 12 and 17 at 40 schools. And in September, when school starts, they're going to have an Eco Leader at one of 40 schools connected to an elder in residence, which is an older person in the community that is mentoring that young person, working with a teacher at the school to engage other kids at their school and other community members. And they want them to be able to do something a little bit more impactful than a recycling program or changing light bulbs. And so they started to ask, with the inspiration from Benedo's idea in Mexicali, what if they use their grant to pay for all 40 of these kids to join the design school, and they paid for all 40 of the elders in residence to join the design school, and we create a space in the design school that is just for those kids and the elders to engage in regenerative learning, to connect them to community volunteer and community engagement opportunities, and to learn about what's happening across the bioregion as a whole. And now you can see the question, why should I invite my own community into the design school, starts to get really, really interesting. Because we start to see ways of transforming ecological anxiety and depression and cynicism among youth into intergenerational pathways to community engagement with regenerative education. connected to funding opportunities to support people to join the design school, connected to the ongoing bioregional weaving processes of the landscape team, connected to inter-landscape or inter-bioregional exchanges of youth. Because if we do this in more than one bioregion, these young people can connect with each other across landscapes, which could fundamentally transform the entire future trajectory of their lives. And so as we're thinking about questions like, why should I invite my community to join the design school? And how could hosting spaces and creating activities for those community members create value that would not exist otherwise? That question is generating profound ideas and transformation pathways. And so this is one of the things that's come up in the last week. Also, as we go back to, this is an image from the design school update from 2 weeks ago, where Penny had helped the landscape leaders to set up their own spaces within the design school. So within the Colorado Basin, there are all these different spaces, and each space has a local landscape leader organizing within their community and collaborating across landscapes. And this is happening, of course, beyond the Colorado Basin. It's happening in all the landscapes in the school. That we're helping our landscape leaders begin to organize within the design school, which opens up a really interesting question. Are the landscape leaders just using the design school to serve their needs? Is the design school using the landscape leaders to recruit community members? Or are we doing something else? It turns out we're doing something else. We're co-creating what the design school is, and we're sharing creativity and leadership to create new capacities within the landscapes and within the design school to transform the whole process. And so the landscape leaders have already begun to co-create the value of the design school with their own community members, like the example of the eco leaders in 40 schools joining the design school, which adds value to the grant and the project and the funding that Brian and Susan have to bring to their own community and their own landscape, while at the same time having a prototyping space to create an offering to then give to other landscapes that other landscape leaders can use. And so we're weaving across the nested levels, landscapes and bioregions, landscape leaders, design school, spaces within mighty networks, different kinds of community members, different kinds of learning opportunities, and we're exploring them. And you can see why we need coherence and why it's so easy to lose coherence if we don't hold this story together. And so the main lesson is that 2 weeks ago, Penny was just helping the landscape leaders to set up their spaces. And 2 weeks later, we're co-designing projects on the ground in a bioregion to be replicated in other bioregions through the landscape leadership and the inspiration of these organized spaces on mighty networks. And so you can already start to feel where we're going with this, which is we're going to be co-creating value with community members in landscapes, supporting the work of landscape leaders, helping those landscape leaders to demonstrate their value, which increases their prospects for future funding, while also generating value across the design school as a whole, which the design school is a narrative and a platform for multiple bioregions to be regenerated simultaneously, all of which is emerging together with increasing clarity and coherence as long as we hold it all together. And so that's why it's so important that we've been building new governance structures. In the update 2 weeks ago, I shared with you that we were launching the Design School Leadership Council. Well, in the last 2 weeks, because I'm sort of the instigator of the Leadership Council, meaning I'm the bottleneck to its progress if I'm busy, I decided that I would do a little experiment for 2 weeks, which is we formed a Leadership Council. We had 17 members of the design school join the Leadership Council, people who represent landscapes in some leadership capacity, and we began prototyping the Leadership Council's norms and purpose by setting up a private space within Mighty Networks and setting up a Telegram group. And in the Telegram group, it's mostly been me starting it, where I would like send a little update out or ask a question, and then everyone would start to respond. And we've began designing the Leadership Council without having to have a meeting, which is really important because we're all so busy. Now, obviously, we will have meetings, but we want to minimize the number of Zoom calls for the Leadership Council because the members of the Leadership Council are organizing landscapes, and all of them are very busy people. So we're prototyping a style of leadership, mechanisms of communication, coordination, and decision-making, and we're building coherence by communicating with each other using a Telegram group with leaders from the different landscapes represented. Now we'll be inviting more people into the Leadership Council, and we'll figure out how that works within this first group of the Leadership Council. But one of the actions of that Leadership Council, led by Anna Purpura, who's on the Leadership Council, has been, as we've talked about on many previous occasions, that we need to create governance for the Design School Fund, because membership dues go into the Design School Fund, and then that fund allows us to do a whole bunch of things: running design labs, expanding the school, supporting landscape activations, providing new capacities to the school or to landscapes, to incubate projects, to do all kinds of things. The problem is we don't have a transparent and accountable way of managing the Design School Fund. So far, Penny, Benji, and I have made executive decisions about using money from the Design School Fund. We've invited members of the Design School to give feedback, but we haven't invited them to make decisions because we didn't have a governance structure. And so what Anna did is she sent out a message to all of our design level members, because we've decided initially that the Design School Fund is available to design level members and that design level members can participate in its governance. These are things that we have said all the way back to the beginning of the school. That she sent a message out to all of our design members and asked who would like to join a committee to set up governance and decision-making for the Design School Fund, because we're already identifying opportunities to use the money we have, but we don't have a decision-making framework. And Anna has gathered about a dozen people who have expressed interest in being part of that committee. And Anna has been waiting for Penny and me to get on an airplane tonight, fly back to Barichara tomorrow, and have more time, because we've been so busy on this trip. We haven't had any time. So later this week, we'll begin organizing the governance of the Design School Fund. That might take a couple of weeks, but we're trying to do it as quickly as we can so we can move into action and movement of finances into worthy projects to continue the actions on the ground in the bioregions. And so these new governance structures, the Design School Leadership Council that is already operating, already figuring itself out, it's 2 weeks old, and a Design School Fund committee that will set up its decision-making, which is preparing to start, that these are going to be really helpful for building more coherence within the design school in the next few months. And so we've introduced these in the last 2 weeks, and we're setting them up and getting them going, and they're crucial to the coherence that we've maintained while Penny and I have been traveling and while Benji's been so busy on the ground. So this leads to a major theme of the design school for the next year, which is, as you can already see with those two structures of governance, that we're working on creating collaborative funding and governance within the design school. But we're also working to set up collaborative funding ecosystems within the bioregions. So a major theme of the time that Penny and I have spent here in the Takaranto bioregion, a major theme has been to explore how to create a collaborative funding ecosystem for this work, both at the level of Takaranto, which is more or less southern Ontario, more or less 2.5 to 4 million hectares of land, depending on where they ultimately set the boundaries, but then also for the Great Lakes, and also for the Colorado River Basin, and also for Cascadia, and in parallel with some other work for the Northern Andes and for Barichara in Colombia, where Penny and I live. And so this collaborative funding and governance is also nested across scales, and something we're working on very, very strongly. It was a major part of our motivation to come and work with Brian and Susan, was they asked us to come and help them plan the summit that they're going to host in January, but also for us to start building a collaborative funding ecosystem, both to support their work and to support lots of opportunities that Brian and Susan are identifying and putting into a database for opportunities to accelerate regenerative practices at landscape scales within this bioregion. And so this leads to just a general commentary that there are three major landscape areas that the design school is immersing itself in: the weaving of the Colorado Basin, the greater Takaranto bioregion, and then extending to the Great Lakes, and the Cascadia activation tour that's preparing to go really loud. And you're going to hear a lot about it soon. So one of the things that's been happening in the last 2 weeks is Benji actually did move to Paonia. Benji has been very active in those landscapes, hosting multiple campfires per week, having multiple meetings with the leadership teams, coordinating retreats and gatherings of the leaders, creating collaborative funding processes, working with the Regenesis group to create a story of place process for multiple landscapes and the basin as a whole. All of you have been watching Benji's daily check-ins and Benji's Colorado Basin updates. I encourage you to go to all of those to see what Benji's been doing, because it is ridiculous how much is happening with Benji being sort of the locus of dynamic energy, because it's not only Benji doing it, but there's a lot happening since Benji went and immersed himself in the Colorado Basin. It's been less than 2 weeks since he moved there. And it's like, holy shit, look at how much is going on. So just go into the Colorado River Basin area of Mighty Networks or watch any of Benji's recent daily check-ins, and you'll see there's a ton going on. It's incredible. Benji, you're rocking it. Just keep going. And then also in the greater Takaranto bioregion, we can create a photo like this without ChatGPT or some other artificial intelligence displacing real-world artists. Because that's a photograph that we took in front of a real tree right on the edge of Lake Simcoe in this bioregion, with real hugs happening before and after, because Penny and I have been running around like chickens with our heads cut off with the schedule that Brian and Susan keep for us. And I'm going to actually go more into what we've been doing here in the last 10 days, but I just want to stress that Penny and I have been really focused here. As you'll see, what we've been doing, we have very little bandwidth to focus on anything else. But quietly in the background, what relative to us, it's been the foreground for them. Brandon and Claire have been organizing a lot of support structures to start inviting local organizers into a framework of coordination and communication for the Cascadia activation tour. When I get back to Barichara starting tomorrow, I'm going to be leaning in much more strongly to working with them on that. And just to say, the Cascadia activation is definitely very, very much working its way forward and making a lot of progress, but I'm not going to talk about it in this presentation because there's too much other stuff to talk about. So apologies, Cascadia friends. We'll give you the limelight in the next round. So I want to just walk you all through the story of what's happened since Penny and I arrived 10 days ago. So we arrived late on a Saturday night, and on Sunday, Brian and Susan picked us up from the airport hotel and drove us to a healing retreat center, which is where this photo was taken. The woman on the left is named Linda. She lives in the oldest cooperative in Canada and has been involved in Marxist, socialist, alternative economic, grassroots organizing, community currency, et cetera, kind of stuff for about 50 years. And she also engages in shamanic medicine practices. Linda's really cool. And we actually gathered around a meditation labyrinth and had a speaking circle and a listening circle, which is a major tool, a social technology for healing processes, is listening circles, something that the indigenous people of this part of the continent like to do. And so when we first arrived, we had been organized into an agenda set up by Brian and Susan around the circles of activity that they have identified for the greater Takaranto 7 generations work, which is to say that as they were networking with different groups in a very diverse multi-stakeholder network, they realized that people were entering from different places and they didn't know how to arrive. So they created a large collection of circles that are custom made to the people arriving. So for example, they have a conservation authority circle because lots of people doing large scale landscape regeneration are arriving through the conservation authorities and don't really know how to relate to the larger landscape, but they have a different circle for land, just because of where people are coming from and where they are in the narrative. And Brian and Susan are very attuned to the ways people get confused as they arrive. So they've created a collection of circles in a way I would describe as opportunistic and emergent, and that will eventually go away as structures. They're temporary support scaffolds to bring things to the next place. And so our journey in the last week and a half has been largely structured by those circles. So the first day we arrived to the healing circle, healing and inner work. And in this circle, we met with these amazing women, including Linda on the left, a woman named Mishi on the right, a woman named Tu, a Vietnamese American woman who moved to Canada, who had been involved in Silicon Valley, who had actually been burned out so many times and had to heal so many times. She became an expert healer by being chewed up and spat out by business as usual. And we met on this piece of land to talk about the healing circle. And now the healing circle could work with two important demographics. Farmers who are older people who have land that is legacy land that they have no one to give the land to because their own children don't want to farm. And how could they engage in land and trauma and intergeneration healing work around community land trust, landscape restoration, alternative economic models, different living arrangements, and other things connected to land and farming, and to working with the young eco leaders and youth and their anxiety and depression in the face of planetary collapse. And so our first day was centered around that thematic area, which later led to the innovation that the design school could work with the Eco Leader School program. But it started here. That was day one of our journey. And then day two, we went to this place called the Bill Fish Learning Center at the York Forest demonstration site. It's a 90-year-old reforestation plot set inside of a living building, an absolutely incredible building. And they gathered a large group of people to talk about bioregional learning centers. And the people in this room represent conservation authorities and their education programs. They represent schools. They represent the David Suzuki Foundation, which is based in Vancouver, but works all across Canada, that is involved in food and education work in Ontario. There are some high schoolers, there are some teachers, there's a kindergarten teacher in the room, and we all gather to talk about the strategy for creating bioregional learning centers to organize all of the education happening in this incredibly complex landscape. That was day two. On day three, I didn't take pictures of the meeting because of its sensitive nature, but we were invited by two very, very important Indigenous leaders from this region, one from the Haudenosaunee tribe representing 6 nations, and the other one from the Algonquin tradition. And they are both deeply, deeply connected to the environmental movement, deeply, deeply connected to Indigenous communities. And we had a 3-hour conversation about how could Indigenous knowledge integrate itself on its own terms into bioregional learning strategies for the greater Takaranto bioregion and for the Great Lakes as a whole. Now, there are things that happened in that meeting that I don't want to talk about here because it's of a sensitive nature, and I want to explain why it's sensitive. It's sensitive because what happened in this meeting is truly historic and potentially world-changing, and it absolutely must be led by the Indigenous people. And so for me to tell you what happened could cause what happened to get out and to spread around among Indigenous communities from non-Indigenous sources. And we want to be sure that the organizing in the next 2 to 3 months is universally and 100% led by Indigenous leaders. So that's the only reason I'm not telling you what happened in the meeting. Otherwise, I wish I could. But you will hear about it soon because something of planetary significance happened in that meeting. And that's all I'll say for now. Some of you have already heard my teaser versions of it in Facebook, in the GTB section of the design school, but I can't tell you more. All I can say is it was so important for us to be invited to the table of Indigenous leaders and to find a place of deep co-creation and mutual respect that we think is going to lead to long-term collaboration. And we think it's going to heal deep colonizer traumas within settler cultures and Indigenous cultures throughout the Great Lakes. And I wouldn't say such strong words if I didn't believe it was possible. And what happened in that meeting shook us to our core. We believe it's possible. And so that was day 3 of this trip. And then on day 4 and day 5, we had meetings that I didn't take pictures of because we were meeting with funders working in different funding ecosystems. We met with someone from the Toronto Foundation. We met with someone from the Environmental Collaborative of Canada, someone from the Great Lakes Funders Collaborative, and someone from the SDG Impact Fund, which is based in South Carolina, but funds major projects throughout Canada. And as we were talking with these different people, we were working on weaving a pattern of collaborative funding partnerships that could support the greater Takaranto bioregion and the Great Lakes as the 2 levels that we were focusing on. One of the key things is that we were really exploring landscape regeneration and educating these people about a bioregional approach and how it could fundamentally change and transform their capacities as funders, while also building the context of relationships in which to create a collaborative funding ecosystem, which is something we think may take 2 to 3 years to build, and that'll be absolutely fundamental and necessary to the work we're doing. And the key thing is that our focus during these 2 days was on the emergence of shared narratives. Some of the people we talked to knew what a bioregion is. Some of them didn't. Some of them are already thinking about organizing around watersheds. Some of them have already organized collaborative partnerships across all of the Great Lakes. There was a collaborative partnership with 28 community foundations organized by the Council of Michigan Foundations, working across both Canada and the US, that fell apart because of absolutely stupid leadership in Michigan. Chad, you and I got to talk about what we can do about that and fix that. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But the key thing is during these 2 days, we spent a lot of time building relationships and creating coherence among networks of funders who can support the work in the greater Toronto area and in the Great Lakes. And we're learning a lot that we want to bring to the other landscapes. Then on Thursday, we had a meeting on Thursday morning at the Toronto Foundation. And then in the afternoon, I got to speak to a group of the eco leaders. So I got to talk to some teenagers, including this 12-year-old boy here in the yellow shirt. He's the 7th grader in the eco leader group, the youngest kid in the whole cohort. That woman standing next to him is his very proud teacher who loves what's happening with the greater Takaranto bioregion work. There on the left in the purple shirt is a woman named Val, who those of you from this bioregional know, she is an absolutely incredible woman on a regenerative farm, very close to Susan Graham's farm, that Elliot Gruen has collaborated on, that others of you know about in the Caledon area. That is those cans you see on the table are cider that they make at the Heartwood farm. That's her farm. Andrew Simpson's there in the very back. You can see Penny there on the left. This was a gathering that happened where the agenda was give Joe a microphone and then tell the audience that they can ask Joe anything. We got to do that more often. That led to a pretty amazing conversation. And so what happened on Thursday night was the shock and awe of me being asked what's wrong with the environmental movement and destroying the environmental movement. That was fun. Going into the depths of planetary collapse and what we can expect about population decline and ecological overshoot. Talking about the Oak Ridges moraine and some of the powerful geologic structures of this region, and a bunch more. Oh, it was amazing. And some of you were there because I think just about every design school member from the GTB was at that event. So it was really cool to just see how much of a presence we as a design school have enabled to organize around the work that Brian and Susan have been holding. And we can feel the future of that with the organizing that they're doing. And so that was Thursday. And then on Friday, we had this amazing meeting about how to organize entire landscapes for regeneration, centered around a very cool 27-year-old nonprofit. Was it structured as a nonprofit or a for-profit? There's a social venture. I forget the structure that they have because they might have had more than one. There's an organization in the area called LEAF. They actually have the handle on Twitter as LEAF. They're old enough to have claimed that word on social media. And they have been doing backyard tree plantings and community reforestation projects for nearly 3 decades. People in Toronto know them and love them. This woman, Janet McKay, who's the founder, she went on maternity leave last year and came out of it really wanting to take their work to a whole new level. She's worked with municipal governments on tree planting projects all throughout the territory. This woman here on the right in the image is Jane Hayes, known and beloved here in Toronto area as Garden Jane, as a permaculture practitioner who's been working here for 25 or 30 years. And we gathered with them, and we gathered with, here is Elliot on the left, that's Janet there in the middle, and this guy Alex on the right, who's a complexity scientist, social innovation platform designer. And our conversation was, how could we treat backyards as private land spread all across the territory as a potential holistic large-scale landscape? How could we create collaboration and coordination across smaller units with connectivity to larger landscape scales? And it was a way of practicing bioregional thinking in a very concrete space. There's Janet there in the black shirt representing LEAF with a huge amount of knowledge and experience. And she basically got a full day of free consultation of trying to help her organization better bring landscape scale thinking through tree plantings in people's backyards, connecting to city councils and regional planning authorities, which she has a bunch of relationships with them, together with Elliot's wonderful knowledge, with Jane's knowledge, this guy Alex's knowledge, envisioning together what does it mean to regenerate entire landscapes as a one-day immersion of practice, so that we could practice applying bioregional thinking to landscape scale regeneration with real-world challenges and real-world opportunities. That was our day Friday. Then on Saturday, we went on a tour of regenerative farms. This woman on the left is named Deb. She is one of 4 sisters that own this farm, this amazing farm called Mount Wolf Farm. The guy there in the back in the white t-shirt is Jim Jones, who has joined the design school. Jim has worked with watershed restoration, hedgerow restoration, permaculture practices, regenerative farming. He teaches wooden spoon whittling classes. He's doing his PhD on how to study narratives to transition agriculture into sustainable food sheds. Suffice it to say, Jim's a cool kid. And Deb has been the leader of the Oak Ridges Moraine Institute, if I remember its name correctly. If that's not its correct name, that at least tells you what it is. She has been an advocate and an organizer of land system protection and restoration for more than 30 years. She's an amazing elder of the community. And as you'll see in the next couple of pictures, the land where they live is a land that she and her sisters own together. And back in 1967, it was a house with no trees, and they grew an entire forest. 50 years of reforestation work of native forests with a regenerative farm embedded in it. Suffice it to say, it's frickin' amazing. And so we were there visiting with them, talking multiple levels of strategy. My book is on the table because Jim and Deb are together organizing a book club to bring the design school thinking and the GTB work into their landscape with all of their neighbors, collaborating, as you can see here, with Susan and Brian. And Penny and I get to be a part of it. Man, they cooked us a delicious lunch, which is another big perk of going there. And so we went there, and that woman in the yellow shirt is Sarah. That's Jim's partner. She was literally born in the farmhouse on this farm. She was born there. She was born at home. And now she's living there, managing the farm, managing their volunteers, doing the work on the land. I didn't ask her how old she is, but I'd guess she's around 40, which means almost all of her 40 years have been on this farm. She left for a little while to go to college and then came back. And she has as deep of a bioregional root to her land as you can imagine. If you want to talk story of place, talk to Sarah about her life growing up on this farm and how the 4 elder women are working on a legal transfer of rights into some kind of community ownership structure so she can live on that land in perpetuity and pass it on to her own children. And so as she's showing us around the different kinds of agricultural systems, the organic farming, the bird plots, the reforestation work, I mean, this piece of land was, I mean, you have to go there to see it, to understand it. It was so amazing what they've done on Mount Wolf. And just for comparison, for context, for those of you who are wondering, we were about a 30-minute drive away from Susan Graham's farm, away from Val's farm, from that land in Caledon. So we're really close to Caledon on this piece of land, which means we could drive over and see Susan. Hi, Susan. That's Susan Graham, a beloved member of the design school. And she is welcoming us to her farm. Her family has 67 acres of land. She said during our conversation that she wants to set up the right legacy legal structure to gift 25 acres of it into, maybe a community land trust, maybe something else. And so we had those conversations from the first moment we arrived. We were given a bowl of freshly foraged native fruit to eat. Our goji berries were there and other things. It was it was awesome. And she took us into her community art space. For all of you who went and visited Susan a little while back in the design school gathering, you know this space. And she took us to their community garden where there are 20 families who have plots of land within the forest on their community land. And so she was showing us all these things, and we were just getting to know her and seeing how amazing her husband Owen is and the stuff they're doing on this land. Suffice it to say, you've got to go walk the land with Susan to know what she's doing. And it is amazing. And so that was what we did on Saturday. Then on Sunday and into today, up to today, we've been having other meetings and conversations, organizing toward the GTB Summit, looking at future visions of this work, combining and integrating our knowledge. Yesterday, we had a conversation with some people about social impact, social innovation, and collaborative ecosystems. Today, we met with someone from a circular economy project working on sustainable food systems. And then Brian and I met with someone from the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority about their large-scale land system restoration projects. I mean, it's insane how much is happening here. And so we're now just trying to get some sleep, let our emotions settle, and figure out what the hell happened in these last 10 days, because so much has occurred. And so the main thing I want to stress as I bring this presentation to a close and give us a space for a conversation is that the design school is moving forward in a profound way. So much of it is about the immersion in the land. A big thing we're starting to do is build collaborative funding and governance structures. The immersion in the landscapes is increasingly shaping the direction of the school, and we are just running, not walking, into the future. And so I want to stop there and say that I hope this starts to give you a feel for what it means to bring more coherence to the design school as a whole, because there are a lot of things I haven't said. Like I could talk about how Jonathan and Victoria are working on creating a bioregional learning center in the Rochester area, how Roberta has been preparing communications with all of the members of her community and planning our visit probably in January when we come back here, that Claire and Brandon and others are organizing more and more capacity for Cascadia. Chad is inkling along, sprinkling conversations for eventually doing something in Michigan. Anna has been doing a lot of work in the Niagara Buffalo area. And there's so much happening, but the coherence is around how do we direct the school toward community members within landscapes, connected to landscape leaders with meaningful ways of collaborating that return those capacities back to their landscapes and build our capacities for collaborative funding and governance. Because we're going to need to raise significant amounts of money for this work in each landscape. And so, like, just this morning when Brian and I were on a call with the Conservation Authority, they had already mapped out about 10,000 ecosystem restoration opportunities. 10,000. Like, their map was so full, there was no land outside of the dots. And they're just in the Toronto area, not in the larger landscape above it, just in the 5 watersheds of Toronto as a city and surrounding area. And they were able to restore 350 hectares of land, 7 miles of watershed, like water edge areas of rivers and streams. Like, they were able to mobilize millions of dollars into 50 large scale projects last year, but there are 10,000 more. And that's just within their domain. And so when you're talking about the scale of this work, it's freaking huge. And so anyway, I've talked a lot. You just heard a big presentation. And what I'd love to do is open it up to discussion. And so I'd love to invite any questions or comments, maybe use the hand raising feature to chime in. And anyone who's been a part of the experiences here in the landscape in Ontario that'd like to share, please do. So Brian, if you'd like to share, Preston, if you'd like to share, any questions that are coming up, I'd just love to hear them. And let's have a conversation. So love to hear from you. And Penny as well. Penny. Yeah. While we're waiting for questions, did you want to share anything?
No, I think let's just go to Claire.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Claire.
I think that was a good overview.
Come on in.
Yeah, wow, that was amazing. Holding all those threads. The thing that I'm really excited about is the conversation around youth and schools and the teachers and what have you. And as you were talking, I was like, I know teachers who really need, like, they are holding this baton themselves, have kind of been putting their own resources and everything. Boy, to add I just love that pathway to supporting what they're doing, but bringing the youth in, because yeah, these amazing youth, they really, it feels like they're kind of being nurtured up and then there's nowhere for them to go. And so to create those pathways, this is just brilliant, because that's exactly the kind of infusion we need in the support. So I'm just like, really go. I want to be, that's just exciting. And then just to sort of alert you to, I love what Benji has brought up as well. And Quinn, there's some conversations about what's going on with Colorado, but for another time, but with the bioregional learning center bus, so, and regenerative education. So
Yeah, I know, Benji, do you want to jump in on that and share a little of what's going on with your meeting with Dev and the bioregional regeneration bus? And
Yeah, you caught me when I was getting a snack. Yeah, I left some stuff out on the counter and raced back. Yeah, I mean, these are just like brand new ideas. Just so much is swirling around here in Paonia. Had an amazing conversation yesterday with somebody who does a gap year program that's been going up and down the Colorado River Basin with students for some time. And they were new to the concept of storying of place or story of place. And so he just saw a ready opportunity to weave that in and was just really excited to adapt his program. Yeah, what else? I mean, it's the bioregional learning concept has become so organic in what we've been doing. We're just seeing these campfires and story of place sharing gatherings, I suppose. All of it has just been so clearly has been bioregional learning. Getting to know each other is part of that, coming together to integrate fragmented narratives. Like there's so many stories of what people are doing as far as like regenerative work locally, but there's just such a lack of opportunity or space for those conversations to come together. It seems like such an obvious, it's low hanging fruit. We could do it everywhere. It's so easy. All you have to do is hold the space. It really is very, very easy. That's been a big insight for me lately. But in these conversations, it's we've been talking a lot about a bioregional learning center and what it would take to found one and to create one, and it's quite a lot. There's a lot of conversations around land and what kind of structure do you build and what do you do. And as we've been realizing that bioregional learning is just like right at our fingertips, all we have to do is get together and begin having these conversations of how do we be people of place and be really authentic and open, really encourage people to share from the heart. That was where the idea of the bus was born. It's like, well, if it's this, if it's just a matter of creating opportunity to see place and to experience it together, let's just move around the landscape. Let's go to all the existing regenerative projects. Let's go check it out. Let's see what people are doing. And let's figure out ways. I mean, the hard part of it is figuring out ways to make sense of what you're learning, what you're seeing, coordinate all of that so that it's available to everybody, so that it brings capacity to everybody. But I think it starts with the bus. And this was an idea like 2 days ago that was born here. So maybe if Quinn is here, no, he's not here, unfortunately. He would have a lot more to say.
Brandon has a Cascadia bus, so he's thought of something like this before. But I'm going to pass it over to Brian, and then maybe Brandon, if you want to chime in, you're welcome to. But yeah, Brian, on to you.
Thanks, Joe. And first of all, a huge thank you to you and Penny for traveling here and for participating in this whirlwind week that it's been. It's really helped to galvanize thinking and relationships here. So really appreciate it. I just wanted to follow up on the comments of Claire about young people and your comments, Joe. I think that with all the forest fires in Canada this past summer, with recent news headlines, I mean, USA Today ran a story on tipping points the other day. CBC, our national public broadcaster, the headline on a recent story a couple of days ago, "Something's changed. Summer 2023 is screaming climate change, scientists say." And then another story, how climate change could irreversibly alter Earth's ecosystems. These stories in mainstream media are going to result in a lot of eco-anxiety amongst young people and adults as well. And I think that having a space in the design school for young people, as well as that intergenerational dynamic, older adults who are working with them, as well as integrating in the health and healing at the same time, that there's a real need for that probably coming up. It was already there, but I think it's even going to be more magnified. So I think that's a prominent role that we can play.
Yeah, just a quick comment on this and then pass to Brad is that, kids today are looking at how fucked the world is, and they're being told, and now set up a recycling program at your school. And it's like, what is it, 1985? Like, seriously? I was doing that in 1985. I was 9 years old in 1985. And like, seriously? And so they have no real meaningful options. But what we're finding is, as we map these regenerative projects, there's so much meaningful, like real, concrete, meaningful opportunities. This week, go to a community tree planting. Like, it's real, but they do not know about it. And there are a whole bunch of things in the schools that make it real, like trying to approve a bus, get all the permissions, be sure there are right bathrooms and facilities, etc. It's really hard to organize within schools. But if you go outside of schools with adults and young people together, which means the parents will be okay with it, they know each other, then all kinds of fluidity emerges. So just saying this is a total game changer. And these young people are really, really scared, rightfully so. So anyway, just wanted to name that and then pass it to you, Brad.
Yeah, well, just to, I always hesitate to speak in these things because I don't feel like I have the depth of knowledge and experience. But I guess I feel for a long time like we can't change the existing systems because they're so flawed. But at some point, as the collapse accelerates, there's going to be some inflection points where we can act. And as Brian was reading that about the news and stuff, it's like it's here, right? We have those inflection points, but we don't have anything to give people, right? And I don't have anything to give my kids, right? Like if you told me that I could jump in the car and go stay on somebody's land in Paonia for the next month with my kids and do
I could tell you that.
Yeah.
Please continue. I have a comment on that. It's a really interesting discovery, but please continue.
Yeah, so I would, take my kids out of school because I think it would be more valuable for them to be connecting with people who are doing meaningful work on the land. And yeah, so, and then I think for me, like when I'm trying to bring people in and talk about what we're doing, I mean, people don't want to hear about how bad things are. They want to do whatever it is they're doing. And so unless there's like this really appealing thing in what you're saying about like mentorship, connecting with the land, elderhood, that's a good sell. I think we can sell that. Thank you for all the work you're doing, Dave.
Yeah, I just want to add a comment. Now, this is Southern Ontario, and for those of you who haven't been here, this is a huge landscape. It's a big open landscape. So there are a lot of people who have a lot of land. I think there were 3 times in the last week where we're talking with someone and they just casually mentioned, I don't know what's going to happen to my 100 acres of land. Who could I give it to that would steward it? Or I want to give 25 acres of my land into permanent stewardship and I'd love it to be regenerated. It was like we're tripping over people who are saying this. There actually are huge, huge opportunities to set up the right kind of structures and agreements where there are a lot of people who would love to have land regenerated and stewarded. But it's the matchmaking. Like, Brad, you're in Grand Junction, Colorado. How would you know what's going, and could you even, move to Canada? There's a whole issue there, but like.
I could. I'm in the car. I'm driving now, Joe.
But just to say, it's like, it's incredible how many assets we have that we don't know we can discover. And so that just keeps happening over and over again. So I want to name that and then pass it to Roberta.
Well, first of all, that was an amazing presentation. It sounds like such a potent trip. I do have questions from that, but I wanted to focus on the idea of us co-creating this school. And I just had a meeting on Zoom here with Chris Casillas and 2 of the young people from his community. So delightful to meet them. And about experiential learning and how they could bring that to their community center. And we had discussed, as part of that discussion, I mean, we had a wonderful, I think, very constructive conversation about that. And then we ended, Chris kind of made the comment, and maybe you want to say more about that, Chris, about creating a place on the platform. And we had kind of started that with the themed dialogue of eco-education, but and again, I can't hold that space, but I would love to be a collaborator on that space, because and if we could actually bring youth into the school as the community level members, and for youth to be communicating with youth across the landscape and within the landscape, I think that is so beautiful and so powerful. And yeah, I wanna help support that in every way I can. I just think it would be amazing. It's huge. It's our future. It's everything really. So I love it so much.
So
Thank you all.
I see Chris came on screen. Did you want to add something to that, Chris, before I go on to Jonathan and Victoria?
Yeah, just I mean, we have such a huge asset with Roberta, so thank you for being here and being willing to share your knowledge. And if we can start to develop capabilities as a school to build locally our own experiential learning capacities, then I think that's just we all win. And so I think I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, heck yeah. And for some reason, I keep finding myself looking over at Sean and thinking, all those young rangers in India, oh, goodness, that'd be amazing. So I'm just like, I'm feeling the tantalizing possibility of really motivated youth. Jonathan, over to you.
Well, it was me, and I had this thought yesterday that if people could say, I have a piece of land and I have the agreement of the owner, and I need X amount for equipment and X amount for living, and I have a team of volunteers, and if we could be gifted or loaned, X amount of dollars, we will do this work and this is what we will accomplish. This is what it will turn out to be. And I think if we had a website where inside of the design school and all the projects happening, that people could invite like their relatives and their friends to go and see, is there somebody working on a piece of land that you love or an area that you love that you can fund to do that project, to make that outcome happen, and to do all these other these connected things. It would be kind of like a Patreon, something like that. It doesn't have to be super structured and organized. It could be overseen so that somebody else signs off on various things along the way. But I think we could do that all over the world. And people would love to go there and give, it may be, there would be a huge range of money that is required. And sometimes it would be other services, in-kind services, or this or that. So keep that in the back of your mind. I think that might be the retail aspect of what we do in people's backyards even. I love the idea of connecting the backyards to the bioregional work, because everyone has this boring lawn and they could have this exciting learning adventure for their kids and their, like creativity on their own lawn, building your own forest, like why not? So that's what I want to show.
Yeah, the container for this that makes it possible is shared stories. Shared stories that bring people's identities together and shared purpose. It's such a big deal. And with that said, Hunter, please, and welcome.
Thanks for the welcome, Joe. Good to see you again. Just about the story that was just shared by Victoria, I'd actually been involved in a project locally. We had about 3 acres of land that we had done something like that on, and it ended very poorly because of a lack of contract and access to the land. So just throwing into the mix here, the importance of these visions being encapsulated and actually this idea of like backyard work and planting trees is something that we've been working on here in Southwestern Virginia in our very little area, not regional, just more the city. And some of the challenges that we've faced in finding shared narratives around that have really emerged when we've been confronted with the legal narrative versus the social narrative. And my day job is as an attorney. And so it's constantly kind of rearing its head of how do you take these wonderful ideas and give them the power and backing so that when potential future institutional pressure, so like when all of my neighborhood gets bought up by some large corporation because hyperinflation and manipulation of the economy, just to shoot from the hip, how do I ensure that those land contracts
that never happens? What are you talking about?
How do I ensure that those land contracts or those agreements have sufficient teeth to them so that when someone comes to push and shove, we bite back and the regeneration stays in place?
Yeah, this is something, an example of this that's here in this region is there are a couple of really nice networks of land trusts, similar to what we saw when we were in Carbondale, Colorado, where there was the Aspen Valley Community Land Trust, which was a network of land with easements and connectivity corridors and land trusts. There are similarly sophisticated structures here in Ontario. And one of the things that we learned is that there are a lot of people who want to set up conservation easements, but it's time consuming and costly. And the principal limitation is the funding to pay staff at the land trust organization to just process the administrative hurdles of setting up the easements. And so there are all these really interesting ways that people can leverage money that don't make much sense on an individual piece of land, but they make a great deal of sense when organized onto a landscape. So if we were to take the Oak Ridges Moraine, that's the birthplace of 60 rivers and all the water of this whole region that we're in, well, there's a group that's been organizing where are the land trusts and where are the other pieces of land and what are their legal ownership frameworks and what are the places where there are people who want to set up conservation easements where they could work on connectivity. And then you have a much bigger story and you could raise money around it. And so that's, again, the power of story backed by what you're saying, Hunter, which is with good, clear legal frameworks, which are extremely important, especially where there's land speculation pressure from cities. It's such a big deal. So yeah, thank you for that. Chad, come on in.
Right. Yeah, it's great to see so much interest around education, especially in education for youth popping up. So there, of course, where you are, but seeing that reflected in the group here speaks to some sort of coherence that wants to build. So that's nice. And there are things that I could also add to projects that we're working on in Southeast Michigan, including one around working with a group called the Great Lakes Sea Cadets that takes youth on tours of the Great Lakes, and actually they do photo documentaries and tell stories around that. So yeah, but I guess the question that I have is around how to channel this conversation into a more sustained in a more sustained fashion. Is this going to be followed up with a design lab or another focused meeting where we can figure out what's coming next and to elicit more ideas from the community here?
Yeah, I mean, I'll comment on that. That one thing is by having Penny, Penny went and set up the spaces for the different bioregions, the different landscapes, and then invited the landscape leaders to step in and use them. And then they started asking questions like, do I want to do that? If I did that, what would I do with it? How should I use it? And so this Thursday in the bioregional design session, we're going to explore how to use those spaces that already exist and what are the best practices. And we're going to call upon things like, well, I like the way that Chris does it. Maybe other people should see what Chris is doing because maybe they're not in a space they didn't see it. And some of that sort of knowledge sharing, but it opens up a deeper thing, which is simply by inviting, like, Roberta, would you like a space for the work you're doing in the design school? Gets the thinking started. And now that we're starting to talk about co-creating, like co-creating a youth program or co-creating, whatever it may be, we're just taking that same inquiry one step further. So I think part of this is building up the cultural acumen, like the shared knowledge and shared capacities to be able to create these spaces together. And I think that's one of the steps that we're about to take, is moving into helping people who are managing work in landscapes to set up online hosting for what they're doing, so that if they invite members of their community in, there's actually facilitated like events and activities, and that they have something to enter into. As we're also going this step further with the education program for kids, where I think what's going to start to happen is the inspiration from that will inspire other members of the design school to create additional things. And we'll start to see things like, well, this clearly isn't Joe trying to make a bunch of money off $5 per month membership dues. This is something else, that we're actually building a big commons. And that's something that'll become important. Like now we have so few members that the $5 per month doesn't really mean much, doesn't add up to much. But if we end up with 100,000 members or 500,000 members paying $5 a month, then there's a sizable pool of money to direct to things, including staffing if we need to, or directing to projects, that really interesting opportunities that don't exist now. And so I see us putting on our training wheels and practicing, or maybe better yet, taking off our pedals and getting on the balance bike, learning how to ride it properly until we know how to use the pedals, to have a better education framework. But I think it's sort of like that the next steps are to explore this Thursday, to explore how do we use the community spaces and mighty networks in the best ways possible, to just start having some shared dialogues and learning about that. And then in the same time frame, start to set up, because Brian and Susan have to give their offerings to the eco leaders by September, so they don't have very much time. So in the next few weeks, we'll be setting up the first youth space, and Penny's going to work with them to do that. So that means others can get involved in that and learn from what's happening and have ideas of how they do it in their own landscape, or how they might be involved. Like, we already had the idea we should invite Roberta to do things, and then Roberta in the leadership council's Telegram groups, like, I could help. I'm like, good, we were about to ask you. Like, we're already seeing opportunities that we haven't acted on yet, because all of this is so new. But that's a bit more of the context of where the next steps, I think, are going to emerge. Sean, welcome. Good to see you. You're staying up late.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a cramming session for me, wrapping up things with Karen and Lamia here. But yeah, just going to the earlier point of, global knowledge sharing, and kind of just what you were saying also in the sense of, kind of weaving at the local level with events. A big thing that's been on my mind lately, and kind of preserving kind of the movement of regeneration that we're all in, is how maybe like we look at some vulnerabilities that are like inherent, maybe not within the design school itself, you know, not to say that there aren't bad actors, or there are, but just in the sense of having maybe contingencies or redundancies built in for this information that is developed, right? Like, in the sense of what's happening in Cascadia, what's happening in your bioregion, right? Like, it's this type of thing where I feel like the information needs to be very well preserved, right? Not only digitally, but like in an analog fashion, and how we can all experiment together to build those redundancies in the case of, X, Y, or Z thing happening, that makes us vulnerable to losing that information and having to, start again in essence, so, obviously it's the passing down of information from us as individuals, but also just trying to learn more concurrently, whether it's the transcribing of in different languages or something, or, just so we can also protect ourselves from bad actors externally, not even within the network. But that's just been something on my mind in terms of, preservation of all the wealth of information that is coming out of the design school already, and in just the larger regeneration movement. So yeah, it's just it seems like there's a lot of important work that the youth can ultimately be the biggest part of stewarding forward, but we need to establish it in a sense, because there's a lot of unknowns, what can happen, where it will happen, at what time.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think it opens up an interesting observation made by Dugald Hind. Dugald Hind is one of the Dark Mountain Collective, and rather brilliant social theorist and thinker. And he made the observation the first time I saw a presentation by him, that the place where the deep paradigmatic shifts are seen in a civilization is in the way that libraries organize information. So which is why something like blockchain, where you go into an end-to-end accounting system instead of an input-output accounting system, or a profits and losses accounting system, that it's not blockchain, it's the fact that it's geometrically scaling. The very architecture of the information completely transforms what it can be. And in a similar way, I see a lot of what we need as libraries in the future is actually real world networks of regenerative projects and embodied hands-on knowledge of how to do things, like vocational and craft-based knowledge. We were talking with a woman this morning who said a big limitation for farmers in Ontario is young people don't know how to do welding, and old people can hack their tractor with welding tools. They can basically build a different kind of tractor, whereas young people have no idea because it's a craft skill. And so there are layers and layers to this that are about what bioregional learning can be. It can be so encompassing, so beautifully encompassing. So I just wanted to add that element around embodied knowledge and craft skill as being one way of making something redundant is to have a bunch of people in your community who can do it. But that's just one example of the strategy out of much, much more to talk about. So totally with you. Thanks for bringing that up. Stephen.
So as perfect setup for me to drop in a plug for Holochain, you talk about redundancy. The Holochain technology allows it, there are no servers. There's no plug to pull. Everyone stores their own data. And the tools are now available for people to start to work with. So if people are really concerned at that level, I'm happy to start to point them to the companies building the software. But this way, everybody maintains their own data in their region, and the data can be shared between regions. And again, there's no servers, so there's no mighty networks that go, oh, screw you, we don't like what you're doing, which actually leads into the reason I originally raised my hand. I follow a bunch of different things online, and one that I thought would be supportive of the issues of Earth regeneration and tipping points and such has started to post all of these basically anti-climate change memes in their blog. And what I'm noticing is a lot of that, to me, I think is just pushback against the New World Order kind of agenda of you will own nothing and eat bugs. And the real concerns that we are dealing with in this design school are being undermined by the people who are pushing, like the battle above us on the surface, hopefully. But there will be times, I'm imagining, where we may need an immune system to attacks that come directly at us because we're in a part of that conversation. And I don't know if there's anything to say at this moment, and out of respect to the time of the hour and a half, it's just something to keep in mind. I'm curious what people might be encountering already and how we can develop an immune system in terms of an alternative narrative or a way to frame it when it comes at us that says, hey, the whole cooperative thing gets reframed as communism or socialism, right? And nobody wants that. So there's just ways of looking at our narratives that can, a keto roll or toss these things that might come at us. And so far, it's great to see that we haven't, but there's plenty of attacks on the rightful attacks in some sense on the fake green, as Joe, you said, I would love to have heard your talk destroying the environmental movement. Because I think, there's a place where we are aligned with these different factions that are fighting, and can we actually bring them into our fold and point more people who might be fighting us bring them along in our direction.
Yeah, just as a brief comment on this, and then I do think it's a good time for us to come to a close, to be honor the time. And we have to do some debriefing with Brian and Susan before all of us collapse and we get on an airplane. But I think one of the things that I'm seeing and is being validated by the art of hosting that Brian and Susan have done in the last week and a half is bringing different configurations of people together to form deeper relationships with each other as human relationships is going to be a very important buffer against propaganda. And so, and it of course has all kinds of benefits, but it's just something to recognize that a parallel strategy, just like having data in digital or having it off the servers and replicated locally, or other kinds of resiliency and redundancy, that there's such power in real human relationships and making those relationships local. And so I think there are many facets to this. And what I maybe want to say to just bring us to a close for the session today is, in these design school updates, one of the things I'm going to try and do each time is just give a broad picture that is relatively holistic, meaning it's attempting to give the general sense of what's happening at the school, even if it's not perfect and it misses some things. And that's because things are going to continue changing quickly. And I'm already anticipating, I think all of us who are paying attention to it, we're all anticipating that the Cascadia activation tour could be transformational and historic. And there are a bunch of reasons why that's the case. So we see ourselves building toward a moment where all of this could become really visible. And we could start connecting with a lot more people. And already a lot of key people are noticing what we're doing. Key people like Stuart Cowan at Buckminster Fuller Institute, people who are good allies, Bill Reed at Regenesis Group, people like them that are in the movement. But pretty soon we're going to be organizing in dozens of bioregions, if not 100 or more. And then it's going to spread really quick because it's just going to have its own connectivity. The connectivity will cause it to blow into a much larger scale. And so we need to be ready for that. We just need to know that the coherence that we're struggling to maintain now will be much harder to maintain then. And the key in all of it is to move to the coherence of the land itself, to organize around the coherence of the landscapes. There was a moment yesterday where this woman doing social innovation for 30 years was not getting bioregionalism. And then I said, let's talk about the Oak Ridges moraine, which she knew very well. Let's talk about how the water flows off of it, which she knew very well. Let's look at how the land has all this organizing capacity, and click, she got it. You know, it's like, the land is so powerful at organizing us. And that's how we're going to be able to have this fractal mycelial complexity, is because we're organizing around all of our own landscapes. And so you can see that is what we're doing with the design school, with the direction and the focus, by really anchoring the coherence to our landscape leaders as a strategy, where we're trying to support the landscape leaders, which includes meaningfully engaging their communities. So that's a natural extension of it. But if we tried to meet their community's needs without the coherence of the landscape leaders, it would all fall apart into factions and interest groups. And so there are all these ways that very strategically placing our focus is going to be a big learning in all of this. Like, I would much rather that Roberta is happy than whatever groups are doing their thing in Norway, Norway, Maine in this case, because there's so many different factions and so much fragmentation in the world that we're in. And we're trying to build coherence around land as the way of actually being regenerative and not falling into greenwashing. And so, and not falling into a bunch of other things. And so, so I just want to really name that. Organizing our landscape leaders means organizing their landscapes, which means all of the community members will have meaningful ways to engage. And so it's all connected in the nested levels. It's not that they're not being thought of, it's that we're looking for coherence for how the relationships will emerge. And this is a sort of a complex system strategy lens for how to do all of this. But yes, thank you all for this lively and beautiful discussion. I will try and get the video recording uploaded as quickly as I can so that it's available to review and share with others. And Penny and I are going to go fly tonight. Hope our arms don't get tired. We're pretty tired. So thank you, everyone. Onward, upward, and inward, and we'll see you all soon.